أهلا بكم أعزائي المشاهدين. هذه مقدمة سريعة للمحاضرة الأولى للبروفيسور بارت إيرمان. وبارت إيرمان هو بروفيسور محاضر ومؤلف للعديد من الكتب، وهو يدرس في جامعات أمريكية ومنها جامعة كارولاينا الجنوبية. بارت إيرمان لا ينظر إلى الموضوع بالنظرة التي تقول أن يسوع أو عيسى كما يسميه المسلمون ليس له وجود تاريخي، ويعتقد أن له وجودا تاريخيا، ولكنه يضع المعجزات والتعاليم الموجودة أيضا في الأناجيل حول يسوع تحت المجهر العلمي، فيتساءل: هل هذه المعتقدات المنسوبة إليه صحيحة؟ هل دعا إلى نفسه كمخلص؟ هل كان محور تعليم يسوع أنه أتى ليخلص العالم من آثامه؟ طبعا هذه المحاضرة الأولى، وهي مليئة بالمعلومات، تعطينا أيضا الوجوه المتعددة ليسوع، أنه كيف تعدد المعاني ليس فقط مشكلة إسلامية عندما نفسر القرآن أو نؤول القرآن، بل هي مشكلة مسيحية أيضا تتعلق بصميم النص الإنجيلي والرسولي. وسنجد خلال هذه المحاضرة كيف أنه حتى يمكن ترجمتها ووصف يسوع بصيغ متناقضة تناقض أحدها الأخرى. قمت بترجمة هذه المحاضرة والبقية قادمة، ولكن أرجو أن تصبروا معي أعزائي، لأنه أحيانا الترجمة تتأخر لظروف صحية أو لأسباب فنية أحيانا. أرجو أن تروق لكم هذه المحاضرة الأولى. شكرا لكم.
I'd like to welcome you to this course on the historical Jesus. I'm Bart Ehrman, Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I've taught courses on the New Testament and the history of early Christianity for the past 11 years. Before that, I taught similar courses at Rutgers University after having done both a master's and a PhD degree at Princeton Theological Seminary in New Testament studies. All in all, I've been involved in the academic study of the New Testament for over 25 years, my entire adult life. At the center of this research, of course, has been the man who stands at the foundation of early Christianity, Jesus of Nazareth. Why devote so much time and energy to trying to understand the life and teachings of this one man? Or, on a smaller but more immediately relevant scale, why should I bother producing, and more importantly still, why should you bother listening to 24 lectures on this one man? I'd like to begin this lecture by explaining why. Jesus of Nazareth is almost certainly the most important figure in the history of Western civilization. A man whose impact on the course of history is completely unparalleled. His effect on secular history, of course, was not immediate. At first, he was known as an obscure Jewish teacher who was crucified for sedition against the state. But within a century of his death, communities of devoted followers had been established throughout all the major urban areas of the Mediterranean. 2 centuries after that, Jesus was known and even worshipped by some members of the aristocratic elite throughout the Roman Empire, as the emperor himself, Constantine, became a follower in the early 4th century. Within a century after that, the entire empire was officially Christian. Christianity then became the central religion for virtually all of what would become Europe, and then on into the New World. Throughout this period, from the early Middle Ages until today, the Christian Church has exercised enormous political, economic, social, and cultural power, quite unlike any institution in the history of the West. And at the beginning of it all is the man Jesus himself. If you're interested in the history of Western civilization, you almost have to be interested in the historical Jesus. The most obvious arena of Jesus' influence, of course, is in the religious lives of his followers. The latest demographic figures of the world put the number of Christians of all kinds at well over 1 billion. Millions of people devote their lives to Jesus, to following his teachings, and to emulating his example. Millions believe that not only their present well-being, but their life for all eternity is determined by what he did. If you're interested in religion, in our form of civilization, you almost have to be interested in the historical Jesus. Even those who do not believe in Jesus cannot escape his influence, as his name, his life, his teachings fill our culture. Just within our own increasingly secular society, his scriptures are used to swear in both the highest elected leader of the people and regular citizens who serve their patriotic duty in courts of law throughout the land. His authority is invoked by politically savvy officials on the floor of the United States Senate in debates over foreign and domestic policy. His preachers fill the airwave and now the internet. Even people who don't believe in Jesus regularly think of him as one of the great moral teachers of all time, whose principles of the Golden Rule and the love of neighbor should serve as the bedrock of our society. Who then was this man whose authority is invoked by kings and presidents, whose teachings are followed by masses, whose life is emulated by millions, and whose death is thought to have brought salvation to the world? It may be worth our time trying to find out. You would think that a person this important would be well known. Evidently, nothing could be farther from the truth. The fact is that almost everyone has an opinion about Jesus, but the opinions are so much at odds with one another that they can't all be right. Turn on the TV or radio, or read any of the hundreds of popular books about Jesus by people who feel that they have the right and the need to discuss him. The differences in perspective are staggering. Was Jesus a Christian theologian who taught the dogmas of the Christian church, including the traditional Christian doctrines about himself? Well, that's the traditional Christian view, but is it right? As an alternative, was Jesus a Jew who did not believe that he was divine and who wanted his Jewish followers to keep the Jewish law? Was Jesus a kind of spiritual guru who provided his 12 disciples with an inspired 12-step program for improving their lives? Plenty of authors of Christian self-help books seem to think so. Or was Jesus an anti-materialist who believed that his followers should live simply, being far more concerned with the spiritual realm than with the rank material culture that surrounded them? There's a popular Marxist interpretation of Jesus that says so. Alternatively, was Jesus a pre-capitalist proponent of the free enterprise system who provided insightful tips into how to invest your money and make it rich? Was Jesus a proponent of American democracy who would support the expansion of American imperial power throughout the developing world? That's what many of our own politicians seem to think. Or was he flatly opposed to the greed, the lust for power, and the will to rule that lies at the heart of the American dream? A proponent instead of the poor and of the oppressed throughout the world. That's what many theologians in the third world have so strongly insisted upon. Was Jesus all these things? How could he be all these things? Remarkably, the situation does not much improve when you move from the popular media to the world of scholarship. Scholars who have devoted their entire lives and energies to discovering who Jesus was have come up with radically different conclusions. just within the past 30 or 40 years. We've seen serious works of scholarship that have proposed wildly disparate and contradictory views of Jesus, setting forth ideas that few lay people unfamiliar with the ancient sources themselves might have ever suspected. This is an enormously popular area of scholarly research. A recent bibliography of scholarly books and articles in the field listed 2,045 entries. And this list itself was not at all exhaustive, and these were just the scholarly books and articles that had been written. The differences of opinion among the scholars who have devoted themselves to these issues, again, are striking. Some scholars have argued that Jesus was a political revolutionary who advocated a violent overthrow of the imperial power of Rome, that he urged his followers to take up the sword to drive out the enemy, but that he was arrested, tried, and executed before he could muster his troops. One can see some of the evidence for this point of view. When Jesus was arrested, in the Gospels of the New Testament, a sword fight broke out between his followers and those arresting Jesus. Well, what were Jesus' followers doing with swords? One of them was named Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were a party of Jews who believed in the violent overthrow of the Romans. Why were Zealots following Jesus if he himself wasn't in support of their views? Jesus himself was executed for insurgency against the state, for claiming to be a rival king of the Jews. Was he, in fact, a political revolutionary? That's one scholarly opinion. Others have claimed that Jesus was a magician who knew how to manipulate the forces of nature in such a way that he duped his followers into believing that his power actually came from God. One could see some evidence for thinking Jesus was a magician. We know of other people from the ancient world who could allegedly heal the sick, cast out demons, raise the dead. Commonly, these people were thought to be able to manipulate the supernatural forces in the world in order to achieve their ends. This was Jesus' own reputation, being a magician, as evidenced in later Jewish sources. And we should note that even in the Gospels, Jesus' opponents never denied that he could do spectacular feats. They just thought that his supernatural abilities came from some source other than God. Was Jesus then a magician? It's one scholarly view. Some scholars have maintained that Jesus was a kind of proto-feminist, whose ultimate concerns were with women and with their plight as those who were oppressed by society, and whose social agenda was topped by a push for gender equality in a completely egalitarian state. Again, one can see that there's evidence for such views. Jesus spoke with women and ministered to their needs publicly, quite unlike, it's alleged, other Jewish teachers of his day. Jesus urged women to attend to his teachings. He had women followers, not among the 12, but certainly other people who followed him were women. As the earliest accounts report, the first people to discover Jesus' empty tomb were women who had accompanied him from Galilee to Jerusalem before his crucifixion. Moreover, did not Jesus preach equality of all, both Jew and Gentile, both slave and free, both men and women? If so, then wasn't Jesus in support of an egalitarian state in which men and women would be equal? In other words, wasn't Jesus a proto-feminist? Recently, many scholars have begun to claim that Jesus was a kind of cynic philosopher who taught his followers to remove themselves from society, to live simply like all other creatures, quitting their jobs, living off others, avoiding every material and physical pleasure, and trusting God to supply all of their needs. In this context, when somebody talks about a cynic philosopher, they're not simply saying the philosopher is cynical, but this is a reference to a philosophical school in the ancient world of cynicism, which was most commonly associated with a man named Diogenes, who supported this kind of program of living simply apart from the constraints of society and not being concerned about material goods or physical pleasure or anything that the world valued. These people didn't call themselves cynics. Their opponents called them cynics from the Greek word kune, which means dog, because they were thought to live like dogs. In other words, they didn't care what they did in public, and they didn't have their own homes, and they had to live by scrounging around off of others. Was Jesus like that? Well, many scholars have recently argued that he was. After all, Jesus quit his job, and he left his home, and he lived off of others. He urged people to abandon material things and to devote themselves purely to the spiritual things of life. He told his followers to consider the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, to note how God cared for them without their having to labor and toil. Wasn't Jesus then very much like cynic philosophers? Some scholars have said so. Others have insisted that Jesus was a Jewish rabbi who had no intention at all of starting a new religion. And again, one can see reasons for their thinking so. Virtually everything that Jesus says in the Gospels of the New Testament can be found in other Jewish writings of the day. According to this view, it was the Apostle Paul who is responsible for changing Jesus' simple teaching of the love of God and the brotherhood of all people into a complicated religion of sin and redemption. But Jesus himself was a simple Jewish rabbi. Other scholars have thought that Jesus was gay. Again, there are points that one can stress as evidence for such a view. After all, Jesus was an adult man who never married in a society where marriage was so commonplace that everybody was simply assumed that they'd get married, every man at least. Jesus had 12 very close companions, all of whom were men. Jesus evoked widespread suspicion for having started a secret society with these 12 men. Is it possible that Jesus was gay? Some scholars have thought so. All of these have been serious proposals made by serious scholars after years of serious research. Some of these proposals might be right, but they can't all be. Why are there so many different opinions about this, the most important figure in the history of our form of civilization? Which view is most historically plausible? And how can we possibly know? These are some of the basic questions that we'll be addressing in this course on the historical Jesus. In the rest of this introductory lecture, I'd like to indicate first what our approach will be to the task, second, what the major components of our study will be, and third, I'd like to provide some major important background information. First, I'd like to say a word then about the orientation of these lectures. In this course, we'll be taking a strictly historical approach to the question of the historical Jesus. We'll be taking a strictly historical approach to the question of the historical Jesus. We could, of course, strive to understand Jesus better from the perspective of faith, if we chose. That, in fact, is how most people do understand Jesus, from a perspective of faith, belief commitment. There's obviously a lot to be said for this approach, since most people who are interested in Jesus are interested in him for personal religious reasons. They want to know what to believe about him and to understand better his significance for their lives and their relationship with God. But there can be hidden difficulties in approaching our study from this kind of religious perspective. I'm going to talk about two problems. The first is a rather basic question that hasn't occurred to most people. If we decide to approach the study of Jesus from the perspective of faith, whose faith should it be? Should it be my faith? Your faith? The faith of the Roman Catholic Church? the Southern Baptists, the Greek Orthodox, the Mormons, the Presbyterians, the Branch Davidians. It's not good enough to say that all these perspectives are at heart the same, because in fact they're not. Nor is it possible to say that we should simply adopt the faith stance of the New Testament itself, since each of these various denominations appeals to the New Testament in support of its own views. Even more difficult, though, is the second problem. If we approach the question of who Jesus was strictly from the perspective of faith, then we will almost certainly end up exactly where we started out. People almost always find what they're expecting to find if they allow their expectations to guide their search. But if we want to know what Jesus himself was really like, we shouldn't allow ourselves to presuppose our conclusions before we've even begun. For these reasons, it might be better to take a different approach to our task. This different approach is not opposite to approaching Jesus from a perspective of faith. That is, to say, we will not be approaching him from the perspective of disbelief. It's not the opposite of approaching for faith. So I'm not urging a approach of disbelief in Jesus. Rather, this other approach requires us to suspend our beliefs or disbeliefs about Jesus, whatever our beliefs or disbeliefs might involve, in order to see what Jesus himself was actually like, to see what he really said and did. Once we've engaged in this historical kind of approach, then and only then can we as individuals decide what its relevance, what the relevance of the study might be for our personal faith. In other words, this is a historical rather than a religious approach to our study. I need to emphasize that I'm not claiming that this kind of historical approach is better than a religious approach. I'm not claiming that. It is simply different. A religious approach makes sense for those who have exclusively religious concerns about what to believe about Jesus. But it does not make sense for those who have historical interests in knowing what he was really like. Moreover, this historical approach does not require that we disbelieve, only that we do not allow our beliefs, whatever they happen to be, to determine our historical conclusions. A historical approach is interested in examining the historical evidence for deciding what happened in the past. That is to say, historians deal with past events that are matters of the public record, which are accessible to everyone of every religious persuasion, and are not, therefore, dependent on beliefs about God. Let me try and illustrate the difference between a historical and a religious approach for you. Historians can tell you the similarities and the differences between the worldviews of Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. But they cannot use their historical knowledge to tell you that Gandhi's belief in God was wrong, or that Martin Luther King's belief about God was right. This judgment is not part of the public record and depends on the theological assumptions and personal beliefs that are not shared by everyone conducting the investigation. Historians can describe what happened during the conflicts between Catholics and Lutherans in 16th century Germany. They cannot, though, use their historical knowledge to tell you which side God was on. Likewise, historians can explain what probably happened at Jesus' crucifixion. But they cannot use their historical knowledge to tell you that he was crucified for the sins of the world. Does that mean that historians cannot be believers? No. It means that if historians tell you that Martin Luther King Jr. had a better theology than Gandhi, or that God was on the side of the Protestants instead of the Catholics, or that Jesus was crucified for the sins of the world, they're telling you this not in their capacity as historians, but in their capacity as believers. My assumption in this course is that anyone of any religious persuasion can engage in historical research to decide what actually happened in the past. That is, that knowing about what happened is not dependent upon one's personal beliefs. Historians have to consider evidence for what happened in the past. Without evidence, there's no way of knowing. And the evidence is good or bad, weak or strong, regardless of whether the historian is an Episcopalian, a Southern Baptist, an agnostic, or a pagan, so long as he or she doesn't allow theological judgments to interfere with the evidence itself. The course will be roughly divided into two parts. The first dealing with what our sources of information about the historical Jesus are. The second with what these sources can reveal to us about the man himself when examined following solid historical criteria. In the first part of the course, we'll consider all of the surviving sources from antiquity that can help us reconstruct what Jesus really said and did. We will look at everything that survives from antiquity that can be of any use. If anybody tells you anything about Jesus not found in any of these sources, then they're making it up. We'll look at everything there is. As we'll see, these ancient sources are the only way to know what Jesus really said and did, because the only way to understand anything about anybody from the past is if sources from the period happen to survive. Our principal sources will be the Gospels of the New Testament. These, as it turns out, are our earliest historical sources about Jesus, and so we'll begin by our investigation by asking how reliable they are for reconstructing Jesus' life. Are these books written by eyewitnesses? Are they consistent with one another? Where did they get their stories from? Why do they seem to have so many differences? These are the kinds of questions that we'll ask. We'll then move to consider other sources from outside the New Testament. There are, for example, a couple of dozen other Gospels that record the words and deeds of Jesus. We'll examine the earliest of these to see if they can provide us with any valuable information. We'll also look at what other ancient people, non-Christian Jews and pagans, had to say about Jesus to see if they can assist us in rounding out the picture. Once we have a firm grasp of the available sources, we'll discuss the task of using them for historical purposes, considering the kinds of methods that scholars have developed for moving behind what the sources say about Jesus to seeing what Jesus himself was really all about. In the second part of our course, then, I'll apply the methods we've discussed to the sources that have survived to see what they reveal to us about the man Jesus. My basic thesis will not sound at all peculiar to those who are familiar with 20th century scholarship on the historical Jesus, although it might sound peculiar to people who are not abreast of scholarship on Jesus. Since the early part of the century, when the great humanitarian and medical missionary Albert Schweitzer wrote his eminent classic, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, scholars have widely considered Jesus to be a kind of Jewish apocalyptic prophet, one who anticipated that God was soon going to intervene in the course of history to overthrow the forces of evil and bring in his good kingdom on earth. I'm going to spend some time trying to show why this point of view, that Jesus was an apocalypticist, anticipating the imminent judgment of God, why this point of view has proved to be so popular among so many scholars for so long. I'll then discuss what Jesus actually taught his followers, based again on our surviving sources, and show what he actually did during his public ministry. The final lectures then will deal with the most important events of Jesus' life, those surrounding his last days and hours before being arrested, put on trial, and crucified by the Romans. I'll conclude the course by discussing how the apocalyptic words and deeds of Jesus have affected his followers down through the ages until today. Throughout the course of our investigation, you'll see that I consider evidence to be an important consideration in trying to reconstruct a person from the past. Some other scholars of the historical Jesus don't appear to think so, at least judging from their books, where they discuss at great lengths their views of the subject, but never indicate how they think they know what they claim to know. In my view, establishing what happened in the past isn't a matter of guesswork. It's a matter of evidence. And people who are being shown the results of a rigorous examination of evidence have a right to see what that evidence actually is. In this course, then, I'll not simply regale you with my own views of who Jesus was, but I'll go to some length to explain what the evidence is. If you disagree with my conclusions, then, you'll be able to examine the evidence for yourself and decide where I've gone wrong in interpreting it. In conclusion, the historical Jesus is such an important figure in the history of Western civilization that we would do well to investigate what he actually said and did. Whereas we could, in theory, approach this task from a religious perspective of faith, it's also valuable to do so from the perspective of historical research. In this course, we'll examine all of the surviving evidence for the historical Jesus, including sources found in the New Testament Gospels, in Gospels outside of the New Testament, and in pagan and Jewish references to Jesus. We'll look at familiar literary texts, more obscure historical references, and the most recent archaeological discoveries. And then, on the basis of this evidence, we'll try to reconstruct the life and teachings of Jesus to decide what he really said and did.